Hello everybody, I wanted to make a video today. I don't know how long this is going to be, but I want to talk about one of my favorite authors, H.P. Lovecraft, and I want to talk about who he is, kind of like what he wrote about, and just if he's kind of relevant to today, if people should still read Lovecraft, which any author, has potential to be enjoyed in a reading experience, but what are you looking for in Lovecraft? What would you be looking for? What types of books did he write? Just different stuff like that, just so you can have like a little overview about who this author was. And yeah, so I just want to get right into it. H.P. Lovecraft was a writer in, I think, the early 1900s, late 19th century, and he wrote mostly predominantly horror stories and sci-fi stories. Um, he sort of invented or helped invent the genre called known as weird fiction or cosmic horror, which is just about different. It's like a branch of horror in a way where it has to do with things that are hard to understand, incomprehensible, or just especially an emphasis on the, I guess you could say, futility of humanity, which is debatable and whether that's actually what Lovecraft wrote about. I don't really think that is Lovecraft's necessary aim in writing, although I think that is the common interpretation. Um, and I think that Lovecraft also just, he kind of pioneered just like kind of pulp fiction in a way where, a writer can write about the weirdest thing possible, such as you can write about a cat deity now, for example, that's like controlling humanity, and that wouldn't be far fetched in what you could do in fiction. And I think that Lovecraft had a big part of that in pioneering that way for other writers to make different writings that are very strange, very weird, and I think that he was a big influence in that weird fiction, like I said. Um, and mostly he wrote in a magazine called Weird Tales, and that's where most of his works were published in. And he wrote most. I think that the longest book that he wrote was The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. I haven't read this one. I think that it's like the audiobook is 5 hours. I think it's like 200 pages. So really, it's not that long, and he has two other longer works sort of similar to that length. Um, But besides that, his books are really short. They're just, I mean, they're short stories. They're not really books. Short stories and novellas. Um, but his stories usually are just like 2 hours to 1 hour of reading. And they're very short. They're very fast. Although I would say Lovecraft's actual writing style is very dense and at times could be hard to work through, to get through, just because at times he writes very much like you're reading an article or you're reading like a report on something that has happened, and you're reading it very objectively, and there's not really, at times it depends what story, such as the Dunwich Horror, which is one of his more famous one, is very much told through like almost an article. Like I imagine a reporter's writing that one, while other ones are more of a journal entry or like a diary or like kind of like scenes from diaries and from journal reports and stuff like that. And it's really interesting. I think that it's almost like found footage for like American or like, cinema now, with us or like characters finding other characters' journals or diaries and then finding out kind of what happened with them, especially with Call of Cthulhu, which is, I think, his most famous work. And in that one, it very much is a almost found footage type vibe where the guy's researching all these different events that has happened and talking about them and like what has happened in the past. So I will say his writing style is very cluttered often. He has very cluttered words, not in a bad way, but just a way that, especially for modern audiences, it's hard to just read it, to sit back and just, read it on in your bed or something like that. It's just like a little more focus has to be put into it, I think, when you're reading it. which isn't a bad thing. I think it's just like sometimes there's longer sentences or just giving it more attention in a way. So I think that's one thing to look for if you do want to read Lovecraft, is just his writing style and sometimes long descriptions about things. But I think often that's kind of the bad side of it, but there's a very good side of this as well. I think that it often adds a lot of atmosphere to the work. It adds a lot of imagination, a lot of um, emotion even at times, and I think that it's a really good writing style. It's just a little difficult to get used to, and even comparing him to other like older authors in the time period, he's still very different, and he is very different than most of the other authors and their writing styles. Like Charles Dickens, for example, I could see some similarities to him and Charles Dickens, but mostly they're very different in their writing style. So I think that's just one thing. You just get used to his writing style just a little bit. But he's not really that hard to read. But it just is a little thing that I noticed, especially getting into Lovecraft. It's just his writing's a little difficult. Um, and besides that, I wanted to talk about the characters a little bit in his work. The characters aren't really that interesting. He didn't really focus too much on the characters when he was writing the stories. He was focusing more on the concepts or the ideas that he was talking about, or even the stories. He's not super focused on making well-rounded or complex characters in his narrative, or even characters that are very unique. A lot of the main characters read very similar, with just characters who are insane or going insane, but not in a very interesting way. It's more interesting reading about their experiences and the stuff that they see and the concepts in the stories compared to the character work, which I am definitely someone, when I read books, I really like when it's character driven. I think it's really interesting being character driven, but I think going into a Lovecraft short story or just story, I'm more focused on, okay, how is he going to tell this tale, or like, how is the story going to be told, or just the concepts that are in it compared to who the characters are, because most of the characters, they're pretty forgettable, and especially I think with short stories, is most characters in short stories don't stand out a lot. It's more just a flash into a world or a flash into an idea, and sometimes the characters are unique, but I feel like generally short stories don't focus too much on the characters themselves. And when I think about characters that, like, trying to think of characters that stood out to me in the Lovecraft stories that I've read, I don't really have any. Like, Cats of Ulthar, there's a few characters who are pretty interesting in there. Or I think, like, the Nameless City, the character's somewhat interesting. A few different ones like that. I think the Festival, very short story, but that one has a kind of interesting character from my memory of it. Um, but overall, the characters aren't that interesting, or at least they're very forgettable compared to the moments that we experience in them, the concepts, the ideas, even just one thing that he captures really well, if you know anything about the concept of the sublime, which the sublime is something, it's almost dangerous, but something so magnificent or beautiful that you don't really care about its danger, such as taking from Tales Foundry, a YouTube channel, where they were talking about Lovecraft, and this concept with it is if you're on a boat and you're like in a rowing boat and a whale comes up from the water and goes over your head, and you're like in the boat and the whale goes over you, like you're in danger because you could die, it could like land on you, it could kill you. But you're also not super concerned because you're like caught up in this moment of beauty and like what you would say the sublime of this like beautiful moment where something out of the ordinary and fearful even. And I think that he captures that feeling well, and that's why I personally don't find his stories that scary. I think they're very interesting, they're very fun to read, but I've never really found them too scary. There are certain moments, such as in like The Shadow over Innsmouth, for example, I thought was a little frightening, but just because like in that one there's more elements of typical horror, I guess, but I don't find him super scary, but I think that it's really interesting, and he captures that beauty almost in these scary moments, which is weird, but Yeah. And I don't think his characters are that complex, although they are fairly interesting and they serve the purpose that they need to serve. But you definitely don't go into reading Lovecraft thinking about the characters. Um, but the concepts themselves, I think, are really interesting, and the concepts and ideas, unfortunately, I think a lot of his concepts, a lot of his ideas, such as Cthulhu, which is his most famous story, I would say off the top of my head, although not my personal favorite, um, just kind of get so popularized and they're so talked about and used in media that they kind of lose their significance. I mean, how many times, and I know he's not the most popular pop culture icon, but even still, the amount of times that we see Cthulhu talked about and shown in different movies or shows and stuff, it kind of loses the original intrigue, the original idea of him. And especially, I think, with how often you see art of the stuff that Lovecraft wrote about. And the artwork is just, it's good. I like art, I like some of the artwork, but I feel like, in a way, with so much of it, where Cthulhu is basically reduced to a tentacle creature, it kind of ruins the original flavor of Cthulhu or of the writing. And I think it's important to go back to that root of, what he actually wrote, like what his actual intention was in writing it, and not just based off all of the media that has come afterwards. But I think that, it is really iconic. All of these stories, all of these characters and ideas that he has made throughout his career as a writer. And I think that even now, writers are being influenced by it, such as Stephen King. I know Stephen King was a big Lovecraft fan and was very inspired by Lovecraft in his works as well. So I think there's definitely um, like reason to read it for that reason, and seeing, like, if you're a horror fan or somebody who enjoys these authors like Stephen King or other authors along those lines, excuse me, science fiction authors, then yeah, I think that you should read it, because then you'll see the root of kind of where sci-fi came from and where these ideas came from, especially in horror and in sci-fi. And if you are a writer, somebody who enjoys different stuff, like, or any sort of art form that you like, I think that it could be a good inspiration, especially with some of the weird and crazy stuff that happens in his works. Now, of course, when talking about Lovecraft, one thing that a lot of people bring up is just that he was incredibly racist throughout his life. And I think that it's an important question in terms of, you know, should we read authors that were racist or authors that, did bad things? In my personal opinion, I think we should separate the fact, or the author from the art. And I think that you can enjoy Lovecraft's stories, which aren't about racism. I mean, I think in one story he says, or a few stories he uses different slurs, but it's not like that. It's not the entire point of the story. It's not what the story is about in any way. But it does have to do with the time period that he's in, where that was more predominant, I suppose. But I think that it's just important to separate the art from the artist. I know people would disagree with that, but that's my opinion, and I don't think we should just throw away Lovecraft and all the stories that he wrote because he was racist or because of any sort of quality like that. So I think that's just an important note, just not to base his writings off that in a way. But yeah. Now I did want to mention, kind of, I guess, what his stories, the themes are, in a sense, which, as I said, is the futility of humanity, which is often what it's interpreted as, or nihilism, that, nothing matters, and in treating, humanity as pointless, different stuff like that. I think that's a lot of people's interpretation, and I think in some instances his stories does have that in a way. Call of Cthulhu being the most notable. Although I disagree with the idea that his universe, his ideas, is completely hopeless. Especially looking at some of his quotes, I don't think, or at least quotes in his personal life, I don't see him as a complete nihilist where everything doesn't matter. I think that he does think there is a purpose to humanity, although he doesn't see it as like a huge like we're gonna achieve like godhood or something like that. Um, but he sees it kind of as we're here and like to live while we're alive or something like that. I don't know. I don't agree with his philosophy, Lovecraft's philosophy overall, but I don't think that he is a complete nihilist or completely hopeless in his writing either. And I think a lot of people get a hopeless vibe from his writings. I disagree with that. I think there's a lot of wonder, there's a lot of imagination, there's a lot of adventure, there's a lot of exploration, and it's not completely nihilistic. It's not completely empty in a way, which I personally don't like reading books that are just completely cynical, completely nihilistic, without any like purpose in it or anything like that. I don't personally like reading books like that. It just feels like a waste of time. But I do think that his writings are different than that. I don't think they are completely nihilistic or hopeless in any way. I think that there is a few moments where it is like, oh, existential dread or fear, and it captures that fear really well. But I think there is hope to an extent, as there's still like, for example, the average person isn't going to see one of these eldritch creatures or even know of their existence. Or also, even in the universe, there's a lot of bad and weird stuff, but there's also a lot of interesting stuff as well that isn't completely bad. And another aspect is basically what I was trying to say is I think that it also depends on interpretation, and these writings aren't necessarily something where he directly tells you this is what you should feel about it, this is what you should think about these ideas. But I think that he presents it, he shows these cool concepts and interesting and thought-provoking ideas, but kind of leaves you to make your own interpretation. So I think that if you interpret it as hopeless, then it's hopeless. If you interpret hope in it, then you interpret hope in it, and you could find that in there. But I think that it's just kind of the reader's interpretation, and I think that's the most important part. But I would say if you are more prone to hopelessness or hopeless thinking, I wouldn't really read it, especially if you're in a more hopeless state of like mind or you're depressed at the time. I would just say it's better not to read it at the time, or even you don't have to read it at all. I don't think his ideas, as I said, are completely hopeless, but he often deals and tackles with these themes of hopelessness and dread. So that would be my only warning, I would suppose. And now, beyond that, I just wanted to say a few other stories that I really enjoyed, that I really like. My favorite, I would think it would be my favorite off the top of my head, this or another one, which I'll mention, is The Cats of Ulthar. I love this story. It's like 5 pages, 5 minutes long, I think, with the audiobook that you could find on YouTube. And that is an amazing short read. It's very interesting. It's almost like a folk tale slash fairy tale. And it has cats. I mean, what's not to love about that? So it's really interesting. It's really fun. And yeah, I think that's also one where the characters are a bit more memorable. So I do recommend that one a lot, especially as just a brief taste into what Lovecraft writes and like his overall career. I would also recommend At the Mountains of Madness, although with this one is pretty long. I think it's like 100 pages. But with that one, it does get a little slow at one point, if I remember. But it's definitely one of the most interesting, especially the ending. It's probably one of my favorite endings in Lovecraft. And other than that, I think my second favorite, or maybe my favorite, tied with Cats of Ulthar, is The Whisper in Darkness. That one is really good. It's very sci-fi-ish and horror at the same time. But that one's really funny, or not funny, really fun and very intriguing and thought-provoking as well. I really like that one. I also would say The Shadow over Innsmouth is really good. It's really scary, it's frightening, it's interesting, and fun to read as well. So I would say those are the ones that I recommend, especially to start. I wouldn't really recommend Call of Cthulhu to start just because it's such a weird read, and the narrative style is very weird and strange. But I do recommend those ones to start with, especially Cats of Ulthar. I think that's probably the best one to start with, especially because it's so short. You could just find it online and read it. Non Lovecraft work, although it is in the Cthulhu mythos, I recommend The Hounds of Tindalos. I think that's a fantastic short story. Probably one of my favorite short stories of all time. That one is really cool. Great concept, great ideas, very memorable, very fun read. So, The Hounds of Tindalos, definitely recommend that one. That one is amazing. But, anyways, long story short, I do recommend Lovecraft. And yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video. It was kind of long, but thank you so much for watching if you got to this point, and have a great day.